The courtroom was filled with tension as the custody battle began. On one side sat the father, his face full of worry. He had been a good father to his daughter, always there for her when she needed him. But now, it seemed like everything was slipping away. His ex-wife, sitting on the opposite side, was determined to take away his parental rights. She wanted full control over their daughter, and the father was afraid he might lose the chance to be a part of her life. The girl, their daughter, was in the courtroom too. She sat quietly, her eyes focused on the floor. Her heart was heavy, torn between both of her parents. She loved them both, but the constant fighting had taken a toll on her. Every day, she was forced to choose sides, but today, in the courtroom, she just wanted it all to stop. She didn't know what to do or who to believe. The mother, dressed sharply in a dark suit, stood up to present her case. Her voice was steady, almost cold as she spoke. She accused the father of being unreliable, of not being there when she needed him, and she painted a picture of him as an unfit parent. The father's heart sank as he listened to her words. They weren't true. He had always been there for his daughter, but the mother made it sound like he hadn't cared at all. It was painful, hearing the woman he once loved speak about him in such a way. The father stood up next, his hands shaking. He tried to explain how much he loved his daughter, how he had always put her first. But the more he spoke, the more it seemed like the court didn't believe him. His lawyer did what they could, but even the father knew it wasn't enough. The mom had more money, more influence, and more people on her side. As the arguments continued, the girl couldn't take it anymore. She glanced at her dad, and for a moment, their eyes met. He looked at her with such hope, but she didn't know if he was going to win this battle. She couldn't help but wonder, could she do anything to help him? Could she change the way things were going? In that moment, the girl knew something needed to happen, but she didn't know what. All she could do was wait. The courtroom grew quiet, and everyone waited for the next move. The father sat in his seat, feeling as though the walls of the courtroom were closing in on him. His heart was heavy, and his mind was clouded with fear. He had always tried to be there for his daughter. Every important moment in her life, from her first day of school to her birthday parties, he had been there, supporting her, loving her. But now, it felt like all of that was being erased. His ex-wife was determined to make him seem like a stranger to their daughter, and it seemed like she was winning. His lawyer spoke calmly, trying to defend him. But it didn't seem to help. The more the lawyer spoke, the more the father felt like he was sinking. The judge listened intently, but the expressions on the faces of the people in the courtroom didn't look hopeful. The father clenched his fists, his knuckles turning white. He knew he had to stay calm, but it was so hard. The stakes were too high. As he looked over at his daughter, sitting quietly across the room, he felt a pang in his chest. She hadn't said a word since the trial started. She just sat there, her eyes downcast, looking lost in her thoughts. The father couldn't understand what was going through her mind, but he could feel her pain. She was trapped in the middle of all this. He wanted to tell her that everything would be okay, but deep down, he wasn't sure if it would be. His ex-wife, on the other hand, seemed confident. She leaned back in her chair, smiling to herself as if she knew she was about to win. She had always been good at manipulating situations, making herself the victim, twisting the truth. The father had seen this behavior for years, but now, in the courtroom, it felt even worse. He had always tried to keep things civil for the sake of their daughter, but now it felt like nothing he did mattered. The father thought about all the times he had held his daughter in his arms, telling her stories, comforting her when she was scared. Would those memories be enough to save him now? He didn't know, but he was willing to do anything to fight for her, to keep her in his life. His lawyer spoke again, but his thoughts were racing. He had to win this fight, for his daughter, for their future. The mother stood tall, her eyes cold as she glanced around the courtroom. She was confident, almost too confident. She knew exactly what she was doing, and she had planned every word carefully. The father watched her, feeling the knot tighten in his stomach. He had known that she was determined to get full custody of their daughter, but seeing it play out in front of him made his heart ache. With a smooth, calm voice, the mother began to present her case again. This time, she didn't hold back. She painted a picture of the father as a man who was irresponsible, unreliable, and unable to care for their daughter. She said he had been absent for too long, neglecting his duties as a father. Every word she spoke made the father's stomach turn. It wasn't true. He had always been there for his daughter, but the mother twisted the truth to make him look like a stranger. The mother was skilled at this. She knew how to manipulate the situation, how to make herself look like the only one who could offer stability and love. She spoke about how the father had missed important events, how he hadn't been there when their daughter needed him. The courtroom seemed to agree with her, and the father felt as if he was sinking deeper into a hole he couldn't climb out of. The judge listened carefully, but the father could see that her words were having an effect. The mother knew exactly what buttons to press, and she was doing it masterfully. She even mentioned that the father had a temper, a short fuse, and had caused problems in their marriage. It was all part of her plan to make him seem unfit to be a parent. The father's lawyer tried to respond, but it was clear the situation was getting worse. The lawyer pointed out that the mother had her own issues, but it felt like the words were falling on deaf ears. The court wasn't paying attention to the facts. It was paying attention to the story the mother was telling. As the mother finished her argument, she shot a quick glance at the daughter, who was still sitting quietly. The mother's expression softened, just for a moment, before it returned to its cold, calculated look. The girl felt it. She could sense the manipulation in the air. She didn't know how much longer she could stay silent. Something inside her was telling her that now was the time to act. But what could she do? The courtroom was quiet, except for the sound of the judge's pen scribbling notes. The girl sat in her chair, her hands folded in her lap, trying to keep her emotions in check. Her heart felt heavy, like a stone sitting in her chest. She had been through so much already. And now, seeing her parents fight over her like this, it felt like the world was spinning out of control. She glanced at her father, sitting on the other side of the room. His face was a mix of worry and hope, but there was also a quiet sadness in his eyes. She knew he loved her, but this battle was tearing him apart. She could see the way his hands trembled slightly as he sat there, listening to the accusations her mother was throwing at him. He was trying so hard to prove he was a good father, but it seemed like nothing he did would ever be enough. The girl's gaze shifted to her mother. The woman who had once been warm and kind now seemed distant, cold, and determined to win at all costs. The girl could remember a time when her mom would hug her tightly, telling her everything would be okay. But now, everything felt different. The mom had changed, and the girl could feel the anger and bitterness that seemed to fill every word her mother spoke. The girl couldn't understand why her parents couldn't just get along. Why did they have to fight over her? She didn't want to pick sides, but it felt like the pressure was building on her shoulders. She loved them both, but it seemed like no matter what she did, it would never be enough to make them both happy. Her mind wandered back to the good memories, the times when things had been simpler, when she and her dad would go to the park or bake cookies together. She remembered how her mother used to be so kind, always there with a comforting smile. But those moments felt so far away now, lost in the middle of the chaos. The girl felt like she was being pulled in two directions, and she didn't know how to stop it. She stayed silent, hoping someone would notice the pain she was carrying. But as the trial continued, it felt like no one saw her. No one understood the silent struggle she was going through. The courtroom was filled with an uncomfortable silence. The tension was so thick, it almost felt like the air was heavy. The girl sat in her chair, her hands still folded in her lap, her eyes fixed on the table in front of her. It felt like the walls were closing in around her. The more she sat there, the more she realized that nothing was changing. Her mother was determined to win this fight, and her father seemed to be losing the battle. No one seemed to be listening to what she was feeling, and she couldn't bear it any longer. Her heart raced as she felt a strange, powerful feeling building inside her. For the first time in the entire trial, she stood up from her seat. The movement was sudden, and everyone in the courtroom turned to look at her. Her mother's eyes widened in shock, and even her father seemed surprised. The girl's pulse raced, and her hands trembled slightly as she stepped forward. The judge looked at her, eyebrows raised in confusion. "Is there something you wish to say, young lady?" he asked, his voice calm but curious. The girl took a deep breath, trying to steady her nerves. She had no idea what would happen next, but she knew that she had to speak. Her voice wavered at first, but she found strength in her words. I need to say something," she began, her voice quiet but firm. Her words felt like a weight being lifted off her chest. For so long, she had stayed silent, trying to avoid taking sides. But now, something inside her was pushing her to speak, to finally say what she had been holding in for so long. The girl looked at her mother, then at her father. "I love you both," she said, her voice trembling. "But the things that are being said, they're not true. My dad has always been there for me. He never left me. He's always loved me, and I can't sit here and listen to these lies anymore." The room fell completely silent. Everyone was staring at her, surprised by her sudden outburst. The girl could feel the eyes of everyone in the courtroom on her, but she didn't care. She had said what needed to be said. For the first time in this entire battle, she felt like she had taken control of her own story. Her mother's face grew pale, and the father's eyes softened with gratitude. But the girl wasn't done yet. She had one more thing to say. The courtroom was still in shock after the girl spoke out. Her words hung in the air, heavy and full of truth. For the first time, she felt like she was no longer a passive part of this battle. She was standing up for herself, for her father, and for the love she had always shared with him. The girl could feel the eyes of the judge, the lawyers, and even her mother on her, but she didn't flinch. Taking a deep breath, the girl spoke again, her voice more confident this time. "I need to tell you all something," she said, turning to face the judge. "The reason my father wasn't always around, it's because my mom made it that way." The room was silent as everyone waited for her to continue. The girl could feel the tension building, but she pushed through. "For as long as I can remember, my mom has always made it hard for my dad to be part of my life. Whenever he tried to visit, she would make excuses, say he wasn't needed, or that I didn't want to see him. But that's not true. I've always wanted him in my life. He loves me, and I love him." Her words felt freeing, as if she had finally broken the chains that had kept her silent for so long. The mother's face twisted in anger, but the girl didn't back down. She could see the truth in her father's eyes, a quiet understanding that he knew exactly what she was doing. He had always believed in her, and now she was returning that faith by speaking up. "I'm not saying that my mom is a bad person," the girl continued, her voice softer now. "But she's been hurt, and she hurt us too. She made things difficult for my dad, and I don't think that's fair. He's always been there for me when it mattered the most." Her mother's face turned red with fury, but the girl was determined. "I know this is hard, but I can't just sit here anymore, pretending everything is okay when it's not. My dad has always been there for me. I want him in my life. I need him in my life." The girl's heart raced as she finished her speech. She had said everything she needed to say, and now the courtroom was quiet. The judge looked thoughtful, but the girl knew her words had made an impact. She glanced at her father, who gave her a proud smile. She had finally spoken her truth, and it felt like a weight had been lifted from her shoulders. The silence in the courtroom was deafening. Everyone's eyes were on the girl as she stood tall, her hands still trembling slightly but her heart full of courage. The judge sat behind his bench, his expression serious but thoughtful. The father, sitting in his chair, looked at his daughter with admiration. For the first time in what felt like forever, he felt a small spark of hope. He couldn't believe what his daughter had just done. She had spoken the truth. And now, he wasn't the only one fighting for her anymore. She was fighting for herself. The mother's face had turned pale, her lips pressed together in a tight line. Her eyes flashed with anger, but there was something else there too, something that looked like fear. It was clear she hadn't expected her daughter to speak out like this. For so long, she had been in control, manipulating the situation to her advantage. Now, everything had changed. The lawyer for the father stood up, his voice steady and calm as he addressed the judge. "Your Honor, I believe the girl's testimony speaks volumes. She has made it clear that her father has always been a part of her life, despite the efforts to separate them. It is clear that the love and bond between father and daughter have not been broken, and it should not be treated as such." The mother's lawyer tried to intervene, but his words lacked the same weight. The courtroom was no longer focused on the lies the mother had told. The truth, spoken by the girl herself, had shifted the entire direction of the case. The judge seemed deep in thought, scribbling notes and glancing between the father and daughter. The girl sat back down, her hands resting in her lap, feeling both exhausted and relieved. She had said what she needed to say. She didn't know what would happen next, but she felt proud. She had finally taken a stand for herself and her father, and that made all the difference. Her father's eyes were filled with gratitude, and for a brief moment, he looked at her as though she were the most important person in the world. The girl smiled back at him, feeling a sense of warmth that she hadn't felt in a long time. No matter what happened next, they had this moment. They had this truth. The tension in the courtroom was palpable as the judge prepared to speak. The girl knew that whatever came next would be life-changing, but she was ready. She had already said everything that needed to be said. The courtroom was filled with a tense stillness as everyone waited for the judge to speak. The father sat with his hands tightly clasped, his eyes fixed on the judge, while the girl looked at him, her heart still racing. She had spoken the truth, but now it was up to the judge to decide. Would he believe her? Would he understand the depth of her words? Her mother, sitting across from them, was visibly fuming, but there was nothing more she could say now. The truth had already been laid bare. The judge cleared his throat, and the room grew even quieter. His voice was calm, but the weight of his next words hung heavily in the air. "I have heard everything in this case, the testimonies, the arguments, and most importantly, the words of the child. It is clear to me that this situation is not as simple as it first appeared. It is clear that both parents love their child deeply, but the circumstances have created an environment of confusion and misunderstanding." The girl could feel her heart thudding in her chest as she held her breath, waiting for what the judge would say next. The father sat stiffly, every muscle in his body tense. His daughter's words had changed the direction of this case, but would it be enough? The judge continued, his eyes moving from the mother to the father and then to the girl. "The fact that the daughter was brave enough to speak the truth in this courtroom is something that cannot be ignored. It is obvious that there is a strong bond between her and her father, despite the difficulties they faced." The girl's eyes filled with hope. She glanced at her father, who smiled at her with a look that made her heart swell with gratitude. This was the moment they had both been waiting for. The judge paused for a moment, letting his words sink in before making his decision. "Based on the testimony provided, I have decided to grant the father shared parental rights. He has proven, through his actions and through the courage of his daughter, that he is a capable and loving parent. The mother will be required to participate in therapy to address the issues that have caused this conflict." The girl's breath caught in her throat. This was it. This was the moment she had fought for. The father looked at her, his face filled with pride and joy. They had won. They were a family again. The mother's face was unreadable, but the girl didn't care. This was the start of a new chapter, one where she could finally be with the parent who had always been there for her. The courtroom began to empty, but the girl and her father remained, a quiet victory shared between them. They had fought for this, and now they could finally breathe again. The courtroom buzzed with quiet murmurs as the judge's decision was announced. The air felt thick with anticipation. The girl's heart pounded in her chest as she sat beside her father, their hands clasped tightly together. For a moment, it seemed as if time had stopped, and the whole world was holding its breath. The father, still stunned, blinked several times, trying to process what had just been said. Shared parental rights. It was more than he had dared to hope for. He had fought so hard for this moment, but hearing the judge's words made it feel more real than ever before. His daughter's bravery had given him the chance to be the father he always wanted to be. The girl, still trying to make sense of it all, looked at her father. His face was soft with relief, and she could see the pride in his eyes. The weight that had been pressing on her heart for so long had finally started to lift. She had done it. She had spoken up for what was right. And now she could finally begin to heal. The mother sat across the room, her face pale and unreadable. For the first time, she didn't seem to have control. Her usual confidence was nowhere to be found. The girl didn't care anymore. This was her moment, and it was her father who had fought for her all along. The judge's gavel came down with a loud thud, signaling the end of the trial. "The court is adjourned," he said, his voice firm but calm. The room began to empty, and the girl felt like she could finally breathe. She looked at her father, who gave her a soft smile of reassurance. This was the beginning of something new. They left the courtroom together, side by side. Outside, the sun was shining brightly, as if the world was celebrating with them. The girl took a deep breath, feeling the warmth of the sun on her skin. She had fought for her family, and now it felt like everything was falling into place. The father reached down and gently squeezed her hand. "We did it," he said softly, his voice full of emotion. The girl smiled up at him, her heart swelling with love. Yes, we did. They walked together into their new future, knowing that no matter what challenges lay ahead, they would face them together.